This wasn't about justice, it was about money. 4,000 years ago, long before banks, before stock markets, before the idea of the economy even existed as a concept, one ruler understood something most people still don't. Ancient debt laws didn't just control Babylon. Ancient debt laws still control your money today. And understanding how ancient debt laws shaped civilization reveals exactly how your money is controlled right now. Civilizations don't collapse because people are immoral. They collapse because financial rules fail. And when those rules fail, violence follows. Welcome to Histo Money, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. When most people hear the name Hammurabi, they think of vengeance, an eye for an eye, a brutal ancient world where justice was carved in stone and mercy didn't exist. That image is convenient, it's simple, and it's almost entirely wrong. Because if you strip away the mythology and actually read what was written on that stone slab around 1754 BCE, you realize something uncomfortable. The Code of Hammurabi isn't a moral document. It's a financial one. Out of nearly 300 laws, the overwhelming majority have nothing to do with murder, assault, or revenge. They deal with loans, wages, contracts, interest, collateral, defaults, liability, and debt. In other words, the things that quietly decide who survives and who doesn't when a society grows beyond a small tribe. Babylon wasn't a philosophical experiment, it was a commercial machine. Sitting between major trade routes, it moved grain, silver, livestock, land, labor, and credit across a growing population. Farmers borrowed against future harvests, merchants financed long-distance trade, builders were paid to construct homes and infrastructure. Everything depended on trust, and trust without enforcement doesn't scale. Without shared rules, every bad harvest becomes a personal disaster, every unpaid loan becomes a blood feud, every collapsed house becomes an excuse for violence. Hammurabi didn't inherit a peaceful society and decide to moralize it. He inherited a volatile economic system and decided to stabilize it. This is the part most people miss. The code wasn't about making people good, it was about making outcomes predictable. Because unpredictability is what kills economies. When no one knows who's responsible for a loss, trade stops, credit disappears, people retreat into force. Hammurabi understood that the fastest way to stop chaos wasn't to lecture people about ethics, but to define who pays when things go wrong. The moment you define liability, you change behavior, you create incentives, you create a system. Debt was the first problem he had to confront. In ancient Mesopotamia, debt wasn't abstract, it was personal and immediate. If a farmer borrowed grain and the harvest failed, he didn't default on a spreadsheet, he defaulted in real life. His land could be seized, his children could be taken as debt servants, his family could disappear into bondage over a single bad season. Left unchecked, this kind of debt spiral didn't just ruin individuals, it hollowed out the tax base, destabilized food production, and increased unrest. A society drowning its own producers in permanent debt doesn't last long. So the code imposed limits, not out of compassion, but out of necessity. Interest was capped, debt servitude was time-limited instead of lifelong. In certain circumstances, debts could be suspended after natural disasters. These weren't acts of mercy, they were acts of risk management. Dead or enslaved farmers don't grow grain, and a king without grain doesn't stay king for long. Hammurabi wasn't protecting the poor, he was protecting the system that fed the empire. Then came contracts. Hammurabi's laws didn't care about intentions, they cared about outcomes. If a builder constructed a house and it collapsed, killing the owner, the builder paid the price. If a merchant lost goods entrusted to him, he was liable. If an agent failed to deliver, responsibility didn't disappear into excuses. This wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. When responsibility is clear, people price risk correctly. Builders build better, merchants insure themselves, trade becomes safer. not because people are kinder, but because the consequences are known in advance. This is the quiet genius of the code. It didn't try to eliminate failure, it assigned it. Someone always paid, and once people knew who that someone would be, behavior changed. The idea that risk belongs somewhere, that losses don't vanish just because circumstances are unfortunate, is one of the oldest financial principles on Earth. Long before insurance companies, before limited liability corporations, before modern contract law, Hammurabi understood moral hazard without naming it. If people aren't held responsible for outcomes, they take reckless risks, and reckless risk multiplied across a society becomes collapse. Wages and prices were treated the same way. The code laid out fixed payments for specific kinds of labor. Ox drivers earned this much, surgeons earned that much, builders, shepherds, craftsmen. Their compensation was standardized not because it was fair, but because it reduced conflict. Every negotiation is friction. Every dispute is a potential breakdown. Hammurabi's system removed uncertainty. You knew what your labor was worth before you showed up. You knew what you would be paid if things went well, and what would happen if they didn't. Markets don't need kindness, they need consistency. Hammurabi wasn't trying to optimize happiness, he was trying to keep commerce moving. And consistency is the lubricant of trade. It lowers transaction costs, it prevents endless bargaining, it stops disagreements from turning violent. In a world without courts, appeals, or regulators, these rules were the infrastructure of trust. But there was one more thing embedded into the code, and it's where the romantic image of ancient justice really falls apart. The rules were not equal. The penalty for the same offense varied depending on social class. An injury to a noble carried a different consequence than the same injury to a commoner. Financial liability flowed differently depending on status. Power was written directly into the law. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was design. Elites were protected because they held land, capital, and political stability. Lower classes absorbed more risk because the system depended on it. This wasn't about fairness, it was about hierarchy preservation. And that too is a financial rule as old as civilization itself. Systems don't just manage money, they decide who absorbs losses when things go wrong. Hammurabi made that decision explicit. The stone didn't hide it, it announced it. By the time the code was carved and placed in public view, Babylon had already learned a lesson that modern societies still struggle to accept. You don't control debt with virtue. You don't stabilize trade with good intentions, and you don't prevent collapse by hoping people behave better. You do it by writing rules that make outcomes predictable, losses assignable, and power visible. Because once money enters the picture, morality alone isn't enough, and Hammurabi knew it. The part most people never like hearing is this. Hammurabi's system worked not because it was fair, not because it was kind. It worked because it accepted something most societies prefer to deny, that every economic system is built around deciding who absorbs risk when reality breaks the plan. The Code of Hammurabi didn't pretend losses could be eliminated. It didn't promise prosperity for everyone. It did something far more dangerous and far more effective. It made loss predictable. And once loss is predictable, power can plan around it. That's why the code wasn't equal. Different classes faced different consequences for the same action because equality wasn't the objective, stability was. If an elite man injured another elite, the punishment was physical and severe, an eye for an eye when it came to equals. If he injured a commoner, the penalty was paid in silver. If he injured a slave, compensation went to the owner, because the law treated the loss not as human suffering, but as damaged capital. The same logic ran through everything. A surgeon who killed a noble lost his hands. If the patient was a slave, he simply replaced the asset. A builder was executed if a house collapse killed its owner, but paid compensation if it killed a slave. Elites held land, capital, and political authority. Protecting them wasn't corruption, it was risk containment. If a wealthy landholder collapsed, the shock rippled outward through tenants, labor, taxes, and food supply. If a laborer collapsed, the system barely noticed. That wasn't moral reasoning, it was cold arithmetic, and it's the same arithmetic that still governs modern financial systems, no matter how politely it's dressed up. This is where ancient history starts to feel uncomfortably familiar, because what Hammurabi carved into stone, we now encode into policy. Bankruptcy laws don't exist to reward failure, they exist to control it. They make sure collapse doesn't cascade uncontrollably. Debt relief isn't about generosity, it's about preventing mass defaults from tearing apart the system that issued the debt in the first place. Central banks don't step in during crises because they love markets, they step in because unmanaged collapse is worse. 4,000 years separate Babylon from modern economies, but the logic hasn't changed. When debt threatens the system, rules bend. When instability spreads upward, intervention appears. When instability stays contained at the bottom, it's often ignored. That's not ideology, that's structural design. Hammurabi didn't invent this pattern, he formalized it. Think about inflation for a moment. Inflation isn't just rising prices, it's a quiet redistribution of loss. It erodes savings, it lightens the real burden of debt, it shifts pain away from borrowers and onto holders of currency. That mechanism didn't appear with modern fiat money. It's the same logic Hammurabi applied when he capped interest and suspended debts after disasters. You don't let the financial system devour the productive base it relies on. You reshape the rules so the damage spreads instead of concentrates. And here's where the irony sharpens. Modern societies talk endlessly about free markets, fairness, and opportunity. Ancient Babylon was more honest. The code didn't pretend everyone played the same game. It told you exactly where you stood. It told you who paid when things went wrong. It didn't sell the illusion that morality governed money. It admitted that money governed morality. That honesty is what made the system durable. Predictability creates participation. Participation creates growth. Growth creates power. Hammurabi understood that if people believed the rules were stable, even if they were harsh, they would keep producing, trading, and lending. Chaos doesn't come from inequality alone. It comes from uncertainty, from not knowing whether tomorrow's loss will ruin you completely or be absorbed by the system. Modern finance still runs on this principle. The difference is that today the rules are buried in legal language, regulatory frameworks, and balance sheets most people never read. In Babylon, the rules were carved in stone and placed in public view. There was no illusion, there was no myth of fairness, just structure. This is why so many people feel disoriented by the modern financial system. They sense that something isn't moral, but they're looking in the wrong place. The system was never designed to be moral, it was designed to survive. And survival requires sacrifice. Someone always pays. The only real question is who, and whether the rules make that answer visible or hide it behind complexity. Hammurabi didn't promise freedom, he promised order, and in doing so, he revealed something most people still resist understanding. Financial freedom doesn't come from believing the system is just, it comes from understanding how the system actually works, from knowing where risk flows, from recognizing which rules are flexible under pressure and which ones aren't. This is the real legacy of the Code of Hammurabi, not vengeance, not cruelty, but the realization that once money enters a society, power must choose between chaos and control always comes with rules that protect the system before they protect individuals. The first civilization learned this lesson the hard way. Every civilization since has learned it again, usually in crisis. History doesn't repeat, it refines. The tools change, the language evolves, but the structure remains. Debt still binds, rules still decide outcomes, power still manages collapse before it manages justice. Those who understand this aren't shocked when systems bend to save themselves. They expect it, because the oldest financial rule on Earth was never about right or wrong, it was about survival. And 4,000 years later, we're still playing by it. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.